The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the deserted desert highway when the red Mustang sputtered to a final halt. Steam hissed from under the hood as Richard Cole stepped out, muttering curses under his breath. His custom-tailored suit, once pristine, now bore the dark blotches of oil and frustration. The car, a rare 1968 Shelby GT500 he'd bought for nostalgia's sake, had betrayed him in the worst place imaginable, miles from civilization, no cell reception, no passing cars. As he slammed the hood shut and kicked the gravel, the silence around him thickened, pressing in. From all sides, he had built his life to avoid moments like this, uncontrolled, unpredictable, dirty. But then, out of the heat shimmer she appeared, a small figure walking alone along the highway, dragging a dented toolbox nearly her size. She wore an oversized orange jumpsuit smeared with grease. The sleeves rolled up above her elbows. Her tight curls were pulled into a high, messy ponytail, and her face held an expression too serious for someone so young. She didn't speak at first, just walked up to the Mustang, glanced under the hood and said flatly, "You overheated it." Richard stared at her in disbelief. "You're kidding." She ignored him, set the toolbox down with a metallic thud, and hoisted herself up to peer into the engine. He hadn't asked for help. He hadn't expected any. And yet, here she was, this kid with dirt on her cheeks and a look in her eyes like she'd seen engines explode and men lie. Richard hesitated, then stepped aside. "Fine, be my guest," he muttered, watching her every move. The girl worked methodically, twisting caps, wiping residue with the back of her arm. He noticed how her hands moved confidently, no hesitation. Whoever taught her had done a damn good job. He crouched down beside her, sweat soaking into the collar of his shirt. "You always fix strangers' cars on highways?" he asked, half amused, half annoyed. She shrugged without looking at him. "Only when they need it." Her voice was soft, but not shy. And then, as her hand reached deep into the engine, something caught his eye, something shining on her finger, a ring, but not just any ring. It was large, with an ornate band of white gold twisted into a vine-like pattern. At its center sat a sapphire stone framed by diamonds. A design so specific, so unique, it froze Richard in place. He had seen that ring before. He had given that ring before, years ago, to someone he never thought he'd see again. His blood ran cold as his eyes locked on it. "Where did you get that?" he asked, sharper than he intended. The girl glanced at him, confused, then looked down at her hand. She instinctively pulled it closer, protective. "It was my mother's," she said slowly. Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes changed, widened slightly, cautious now. Richard stood up fast, stepping back. His heart pounded in his chest like an alarm. It couldn't be. That ring, he had it custom-made, only unexisted, and it had been lost, along with everything else, when Angela disappeared. No one had seen her since, no body, no answers, just a cold silence that had followed Richard for years. Now, on this road, in front of this girl, it all came rushing back like a wound, reopened without warning. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time saw past the dirt and grease, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her chin, and something deep, buried in his gut, twisted violently. She stared back at him, unsure of why he looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her tone stiffening. Richard couldn't find words. He looked up the road, then back to her. "What's your name?" he asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. The girl narrowed her eyes, stepped back slightly, and clutched the ringed hand behind her back. "Zoe." That name hit him harder than he expected. Angela used to talk about that name when they were together. If they ever had a daughter, Zoe. He swallowed hard, not trusting his own voice anymore. The air between them thickened. Richard took a step closer, trying to keep his voice steady. "Zoe, where's your mom now?" The girl looked away. Her lips pressed tight before she answered. "She's gone." Just 2 words, but they pierced him. The tone wasn't rehearsed, not robotic like something foster kids are taught to say. It was raw, unfinished. Richard backed away, his mind racing. He had stumbled onto something impossible, something that couldn't be real, and yet here she was with that ring and that name, standing over the broken machine that had brought them together. Silence settled again. The desert wind rustled through dry bushes at the roadside. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but stopped. There were too many questions, too much to unravel, and the girl didn't look like she was going to trust him easily. She turned back to the Mustang, tightening a bolt. "It should start now," she said, then wiped her hands on the jumpsuit. He nodded, distracted, then reached for his keys. The engine roared back to life. Zoe gave it a quick glance and stepped away. "You're good to go," she added. Her job done, she grabbed her toolbox and began walking again. No goodbye, no look back. Richard watched her walk, the setting sun casting a long shadow behind her. The red taillights of the Mustang flickered in the heat haze, but he didn't get in. He stood there, hands trembling slightly. He had to know more. He needed to know more. Whoever this girl was, she had just ripped open a chapter of his life he had tried desperately to bury. And now, standing alone on the highway, Richard Cole realized the road ahead wasn't just pavement. It was memory, guilt, and maybe redemption. He climbed back into the driver's seat but didn't turn the wheel. Instead, he sat still, eyes locked on the mirror, watching Zoe disappear into the horizon. One thing was certain: this wasn't over, not even close. In the dusty outskirts of a nowhere desert town, where mobile homes sat like forgotten toys scattered across cracked earth, Zoe lived in a metal trailer that buzzed at night from faulty wires and groaned when the wind pressed against its thin walls. The place didn't look like much from the outside, and it wasn't much on the inside either. A single couch patched with duct tape, a broken television stacked on old milk crates, and a fridge that clicked louder than it cooled. But for Zoe, it was home, or at least the latest version of it. She'd lived in 4 different homes in the last 2 years. This one, with a man named Carl who smelled like sweat and gasoline, had lasted the longest. Zoe never called him Dad. He never told her to. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either. Carl treated her like a tenant, someone who owed him something, even if she didn't understand what. He never hit her, never screamed, but he didn't care. And sometimes that was worse. He spoke in instructions, not conversations. Fix the belt on the generator. Don't touch the whiskey. Stay away from the back shed. She obeyed because the alternatives were always worse. And she stayed quiet, because that's what got her through. But there was one place in that trailer where Zoe felt something close to comfort: the toolbox. It was the only thing her mother had left behind before disappearing. A large, rusted craftsman box with her name engraved on the underside. Zoe remembered how, when she was younger, she'd sit beside her mother as she fixed cars out behind a mechanic shop in town. Her hands were always dirty, her face always calm. "Machines don't lie," she'd say, tightening a bolt. "People do." That sentence lived inside Zoe's head, looping when she worked under hoods, when she listened to Carl on the phone whispering things he didn't want her to hear, or when someone asked her where her mother had gone and she had to shrug. The truth was, Zoe didn't know. Nobody did. But she remembered her voice, her smell, the way she would gently twist the ring on her finger when she was thinking. That same ring now lived on Zoe's hand, too big, always spinning, always cold. She never took it off, not even to sleep, not even when Carl told her to. "Looks expensive," he once muttered. "Don't go flashing that around. Someone might take it." Zoe had stared at him then, unblinking. "They'd have to take the finger too," she said. He didn't bring it up again. School wasn't a place Zoe fit into. She was too quiet, too smart in ways that didn't get gold stars. She didn't care about history dates or grammar rules, but if a lawnmower died in the yard, or if someone's bike chain snapped, she could fix it in minutes. Teachers called her distant. Students called her weird. But a few, the ones who had older brothers with trucks or dads with motorcycles, whispered her name like a secret. If something broke, find Zoe. She'd know what to do. She never charged. She just liked the Puzzle of it, figuring out what was wrong, using her hands to make it right again. But even in her calmest moments, Zoe carried a weight she didn't understand. A pressure in her chest that tightened every time she looked at a family that laughed together. Every time she saw a mother brushing her daughter's hair in the school parking lot. Zoe never cried about it. That wasn't her way. Instead, she got quiet. She worked more. She dug her hands deeper into engines, into gears, into anything that made more sense than people. She didn't want pity. She wanted answers. But no one ever gave her any. And Carl changed the subject every time. One night, when the wind was loud and the desert sky burned orange with lightning, Zoe crept out of the trailer and sat beside the Mustang she had been fixing for a neighbor. She ran her fingers over the hood, then looked at the ring, her reflection warped in the sapphire stone. "Did you really wear this?" she whispered. Her voice sounded too soft in the open night. A tear slid down her cheek before she even felt it coming. "Where did you go, Mom?" The silence answered back, heavy and indifferent. But she didn't move. She stayed. There until the thunder faded. Carl rarely asked where she went. He barely noticed when she returned home dirty or late. But that morning, after the storm, he saw the ring glowing in the morning light, and his eyes lingered on it too long. "You should hide that thing," he said again. "Not everyone who sees it is gonna ask nicely." But there was something new in his voice, tightness or fear maybe. Zoe didn't reply. But later that day, she made sure to check the lock on her box, twice. When she found Richard on the road, it wasn't fate, it was habit. She always scanned the highway on weekends, watching for broken down cars. Sometimes she helped, sometimes they refused, sometimes they offered money and she declined. But this man, this stranger in a ruined suit, he wasn't like the others. He looked at her like he'd seen something from another life, and when he asked about the ring, when he froze like he'd seen a ghost, something changed. For the first time, someone didn't just see the ring, he recognized it. That scared her more than anything. Back home that night, Zoe didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, fingers brushing the edges of the stone. Why did he care? She asked the dark. Carl snored from the next room, oblivious, but Zoe's mind was racing. Who was that man? Why did he look so shocked? Why did he know the ring? For a child who had always been in the dark, a single light had finally flickered on, and once it did, she couldn't ignore it. Something was coming. She could feel it, and she wasn't sure if she should run from it or run toward it. Richard Cole didn't believe in disorder. Every morning, his alarm chimed at precisely 5:45 a.m., followed by a cold shower, a protein smoothie, and a 10-minute session of breathwork. His closet was color-coded, his calendar scheduled to the minute, and his staff trained to operate with machine-like precision. From the outside, his world looked flawless. Sleek office buildings with his name etched on the glass, luxury vehicles parked in neat rows, and press coverage that spoke of a man who had conquered everything he touched. Success wasn't a concept for Richard. It was his reality, built from years of calculated moves, relentless work, and total control. He had carved his empire out of the automotive world with the sharpness of a scalpel. The Cole Automotive Group had started with a single dealership and expanded into a billion-dollar brand known for exclusivity, precision, and style. Richard was the face of that empire, always sharp in his suits, always calm under pressure, always surrounded by admirers who whispered his name at charity galas and business summits. He was the man people studied, quoted, envied. But beneath the luxury and order was something else, something no one saw. In his penthouse, high above the buzz of Los Angeles, there was one room Richard never let guests enter. A study tucked behind a wall panel, accessible only by a fingerprint scan. Inside it was simple, no gold trim, no art collection, just a desk, a leather chair, and a single photo frame. Face down on the shelf, he never picked it up, never dusted it, but he never removed it either. That frame had sat there for over a decade. The woman inside it, frozen in time, never aged. Angela. He hadn't spoken her name out loud since the day she disappeared. And no one, not even his closest associates, dared bring her up. She had vanished without explanation. No note, no phone call. One day she was beside him in a meeting, the next, gone. At the time, Richard told everyone it was a private matter. The press ran brief, vague headlines. Cole, associate resigns, suddenly. No comment from Richard Cole, and then moved on. But Richard hadn't. He buried himself in work. He erased every trace of her from the office, every file, every message, every photograph, except the one in the frame that he kept, as if punishing himself for something he never admitted out loud. Angela had been different. She wasn't impressed by wealth or influence. She had laughed the first time he showed her his private car collection. "They're just machines," she said. "They don't care who owns them." That had struck him. Her humility was irritating at first. Then it became magnetic. She challenged him, grounded him, loved him in a way that made him feel seen, not for the empire he built, but for the man behind it. And when she disappeared, something inside Richard calcified. He told himself she'd left because she didn't want the life he offered. He told himself she chose freedom, but deep down he always wondered if she'd been taken from him. The world never questioned it. Richard kept everything surface level. He smiled for cameras, signed deals, cut ribbons, and when asked about family, he gave vague replies. No children yet. Too busy to settle down, just focused on work. It became a rhythm, a performance, and eventually he started believing it. Until the day on the highway, until the girl, until the ring. Since that moment, his mind refused to return to its controlled state. That night, he stood in his hidden study, staring at the frame. His hand hovered over it for what felt like hours before finally flipping it over. Angela's eyes stared back at him, full of life, and on her hand, clear as ever, was the ring, that exact ring. He zoomed in, compared. There was no doubt. It was custom, a design she'd helped create, her initials engraved inside the band. This doesn't sense, he whispered. His pulse thudded in his ears. If that ring ended up on a child's hand, where had Angela gone? What had happened after she disappeared? The next day, Richard skipped his routine. No gym, no smoothie. He sat in his office, blinds closed, replaying the encounter on the highway. Over and over, he remembered the way the girl looked at him, defensive, cautious, too old for her age. Her name, Zoe. That name rang louder than anything. Angela used to talk about it all the time. "If we ever have a daughter," she'd said once, laughing as they watched a sunset, "I want to call her Zoe." He had laughed it off, said it sounded too innocent for this world, but she had loved it, and now here it was, echoing back to him from a stranger's lips. He called his assistant, barked orders. "Find everything on Angela that we buried." "All of it." She hesitated. "Sir, you told us to delete." "I don't care, find it." That urgency wasn't like him. People noticed. His staff whispered, his partners exchanged looks. But Richard didn't care. Something had cracked. Something he'd spent years sealing shut. The past was rising like a tide, and it was bringing something with it he wasn't ready for. Late that night, Richard returned home and sat in his car long after parking. The city lights flickered below. He stared at the dashboard, unmoving. The girl's voice echoed again. It was my mother's. He clenched the steering wheel, jaw tight. If Zoe was Angela's daughter, then who was? The father? He refused to answer that question yet, not without proof, but something deep inside was already forming the answer, and it terrified him. Richard Cole didn't believe in instincts. He believed in data, logic, timing, things he could see, calculate, and control. But ever since he had met that girl on the highway, something had shifted in him. A weight he couldn't name had settled in his chest. He tried to move on, to return to his routines, but every attempt felt hollow. Meetings blurred, emails remained unanswered. The sound of that girl's voice, soft, calm, too composed for her age, kept replaying in his mind. It was my mother's. And that ring, that damn ring, no matter how many times he told himself it could be a coincidence, he knew better. That ring was one of a kind, and she was wearing it. He started spending long hours alone in the study again, digging through archived documents his assistant had recovered, old messages, financial records, photos he hadn't looked at in over a decade. Every image of Angela made his chest tighten. Her handwriting in old notes, receipts from a road trip they'd taken through Arizona, a sketch she had made of a ring. That ring. He zoomed in on the blueprint she had drawn and found it exactly as he remembered. She'd even labeled it Zoe's ring. He had laughed at the name when she showed it to him. Now it haunted him. Meanwhile, somewhere across the desert, Zoe was sitting on the floor of her room, tracing the edge of that same ring with her thumb. She had sensed something shift in Carl. He hadn't spoken much since she got back from the highway. He kept eyeing the ring like it was a snake coiled around her finger. She noticed the way he flinched when she mentioned the man in the suit. "Don't go talking to strangers," he snapped. "Especially not rich ones." She asked him why. He didn't answer, just stormed out and slammed the door. That was new. Carl usually didn't care enough to yell. That night Zoe dreamed of her mother. It wasn't a memory, more like a shadow of one. Her mum was standing in a garage, laughing, calling her over. "Come here, Zoe," she'd said. "I want to show you something." But just before Zoe reached her, the scene melted. Away. She woke up in a sweat, heart pounding. It was the first time she had seen her mum's face clearly in a dream in years. Something was shifting inside her too, like a compass suddenly pointing somewhere new. She didn't know where, but she knew she had to follow it. Richard couldn't let it go. He began pulling favors, contacting old investigators and retired security consultants who owed him from his early days. "Find out what happened to Angela," he said, quietly. Most gave him the same answer. Nothing had ever turned up. She left. No trace, no financial activity, no ID use, just gone. But one name kept resurfacing. A man named Curtis Maddox, a private investigator Angela had contacted weeks before she vanished. That had never come up in the original report. Richard called in a contact and got an address. Maddox was living off-grid in an RV near the Nevada border. Back at the trailer park, Zoe began snooping through Carl's things when he wasn't home. Something inside her told her he knew more than he admitted. In the back of the closet, under a pile of junk, she found a shoebox wrapped in duct tape. Inside were old papers, some of her school reports, and a photo she'd never seen before. It was of her mother, pregnant, alone, standing beside a car Zoe didn't recognize. On the back of the photo, in fading ink, someone had written, "RC never knew." That sent chills down her spine. She didn't know who RC was, but something told her she'd just opened the door to a truth no one wanted her to find. Richard drove for hours without telling anyone where he was going. He needed answers, answers no one else could give. The desert stretched endlessly around him as he approached the RV. Maddox answered the door with a shotgun in hand, but softened when he saw Richard. "Didn't think you'd ever come looking," he muttered. Inside, the RV was cramped, dusty, and filled with files stacked like tombstones. Maddox lit a cigarette and handed Richard a worn folder labeled Angela M. Case. Richard's hands shook as he opened it. Inside were photos, notes, and something he never expected, a birth certificate with Zoe's name. Mother, Angela Morgan. Father, unknown. That word, unknown, hit like a blade. Maddox explained that Angela had come to him afraid, said someone was watching her. She wanted to disappear. She told him she was pregnant, but never named the father. Richard pressed him, demanded more, but Maddox just shrugged. "She didn't trust anyone," he said. Said the father had too much to lose, that he wouldn't believe her. Richard fell silent. The words lodged deep. He couldn't deny it anymore. That girl wasn't just some roadside mechanic. She was blood, his blood. Zoe, meanwhile, was facing her own storm. That night, Carl came home drunk and angry. "You've been snooping," he said. She didn't answer. He grabbed her arm too tight. "That man on the road, what did he say to you?" She yanked free, heart racing. "Nothing," she shouted. But the way he looked at her, it wasn't like before. It was fear, desperation. He wasn't hiding indifference anymore. He was hiding something else, something big. And Zoe realized, maybe for the first time, that she wasn't safe anymore. Richard stood outside the RV, wind whipping around him, folder in hand. The road behind him was long, but the road ahead was heavier. He could no longer ignore what he had found. He had to go back. He had to find her, not just for Angela, for the girl, for Zoe. Because now every cell in his body was screaming the same thing. She was his daughter, and if that was true, then she was in danger. And he had let it happen. For 10 years he had looked the other way. Now that choice had come back, wearing a ring. Richard Cole wasn't used to being ignored. In boardrooms, his voice commanded silence. At galas, his presence turned heads. But as he stood outside the battered trailer, surrounded by scorched dirt and the stench of gasoline, none of that power mattered. He had driven for hours, dust from the highway, still clinging to his tires, his mind playing and replaying the scene on the roadside, the girl, the ring, her voice. This time he came prepared, not with lawyers or security teams, but with words, with questions, with the hope that something inside him hadn't been lost forever. But Carl wasn't the kind of man you convinced with charm. The moment he stepped out onto the porch, Richard knew this was going to go badly. Carl's eyes were bloodshot, jaw tight, beer can already half empty, even though it was barely noon. He didn't ask who Richard was, didn't shake his hand, just stared. Richard spoke. Clearly, his voice calm but firm. "I think Zoe is my daughter," he said. "I just want to talk to her." Carl snorted, took a sip from the can and said, "A lot of people think a lot of things. Doesn't make them true." Then he stepped forward, close enough for Richard to smell the mix of sweat and liquor. "You need to leave," he said. "Now." Richard didn't move. "She deserves to know the truth." That made Carl's face darken. "You don't know a damn thing about what she deserves." And just like that, the conversation ended. The door slammed shut. Richard stood on the porch for a full minute, fists clenched, heartbeat pounding in his ears. Inside the trailer, Zoe had heard everything. She had been standing just behind the curtain, frozen. The second she saw Richard's car pull into the lot, she knew. She didn't need confirmation. Her heart had done something strange, leapt and twisted at the same time. The man from the highway, the one who had looked at her like he knew her before she even spoke. Now, he was here, asking for her, saying things she had dreamed of hearing but never dared hope for. She had pressed her hands against the wall as if it might give her a better view, but all she could do was listen. And when the door slammed, she didn't move. Her eyes just filled with something hot and unbearable. She stayed in her room for hours, the sound of Carl pacing and cursing in the next room, slicing through the silence like broken glass. He didn't speak to her directly, didn't ask what she had heard. He knew, and she knew he knew. That night, after the lights went out and the trailer fell into its usual eerie quiet, Zoe crept out of bed and opened the window. The night air was cold, dry, full of the kind of silence that only deserts could hold. She pulled her hoodie tight and stepped into the darkness. Her bare feet touched the dirt path that led to the edge of the lot, the place where Richard had parked earlier. She sat on an old tire, half buried in the ground, and waited. She waited until the stars faded and the sky began to change colors. She kept thinking. Maybe he'd come back. Maybe he was just driving around the block. Maybe he was giving her time. But no one came. No car. No voice calling her name. Just the wind and the sound of Carl's snores drifting faintly from the trailer. When the first sliver of sun touched the horizon, she stood and walked. Back, her shoulders heavier than before. She didn't cry, but something had cracked. She could feel it, a quiet, growing fracture in everything she thought she had accepted. Richard miles away by then, sat in his office like a ghost of himself. The sun hadn't risen yet in Los Angeles, but he was. Already on his second glass of bourbon, his assistant had left messages, board members had called, but none of it mattered. The image of Zoe's face, brief, shocked, hopeful, kept slicing through his thoughts. He had seen her behind the curtain. For a second, just a second, their eyes had met. And that was the part he couldn't stop thinking about. She had looked at him not like a stranger, not like a child meeting a man for the first time, but like someone who was waiting. The failure ate at him in a way no business loss ever had. He had walked away from deals worth hundreds of millions. But walking away from her, this time it felt like a betrayal, like he had failed someone who needed him most. He thought of Angela, her voice, the promises they had made. He poured another drink and pulled up Carl Deacon's name on his laptop. If he couldn't speak to Zoe, then he'd find out everything. About the man keeping her locked away. "Run a full report," he told his investigator over the phone. "Employment history, financials, criminal background. I want to know what he's hiding." Zoe, back at school the next day, was silent. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't answer questions in class, but she watched. She observed every movement Carl made when he picked her up, how his eyes darted toward the teachers, how his hands clenched the steering wheel. Something had changed in him too. He was scared. She could feel it, and that gave her courage. She began looking through drawers. At night, not recklessly, quietly, carefully. She searched the closet, the kitchen, even under the floorboards where the tile was loose. It was there that she found it. Wrapped in a plastic bag inside a rusted toolbox was a stack of papers. Most were old receipts, but at the very bottom, folded, 3 times, was a letter. It was sealed, addressed to R.C. Zoe's breath caught. Her fingers trembled. She didn't open it. Not yet, but she knew. Deep down, she knew. This was the missing piece, something her mother had written. And R.C. Those were the same initials on the letterhead she'd seen. In Carl's drawer weeks ago. She didn't need a dictionary to understand what it meant. The man from the highway wasn't just a stranger. He was part of the story she had never been told. Carl never knew she had found it, but she began watching him more closely. Not with fear, but with strategy. She needed time. She needed a plan. She needed to find Richard again, because now she had something real, proof, and she wasn't going to let anyone bury it. Richard, now armed with the beginnings of Carl's background check, saw what he had suspected. Arrests, gaps in employment, a connection to a private adoption agency flagged for irregularities years ago. Nothing concrete yet, but enough to know Zoe wasn't safe. And this time, he wouldn't knock. He would find a way in, whatever it took. Zoe didn't open the letter that first night. She couldn't. Her fingers had hovered over the torn seal, her heart punching hard in her chest, but something deep inside warned her to wait. She wasn't ready. Not yet. She hid the envelope beneath her mattress, then lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling as the desert wind scraped against the trailer walls. She replayed the last few days in her mind like a movie she couldn't pause. The man on the road, the ring, the look on Carl's face when he saw Richard, and now the letter addressed to R.C. That name echoed louder now. The pieces were moving, but the picture was still unclear. The next morning, Zoe skipped breakfast. Carl didn't notice. He was already half checked out, muttering to himself over coffee, phone in hand, always glancing toward her with that mix of suspicion and regret. She knew he was nervous. He wasn't hiding it well anymore. When she left for school, she didn't go to the bus stop. She walked 3 blocks out of the trailer park and ducked into the old scrapyard where she used to play when she was younger. There, among piles of twisted metal and sun-bleached car doors, she crouched beside a burned-out van and pulled the letter from her backpack. She held it for a long time, then finally she opened it. Angela's handwriting was slanted and fast, the kind that looked rushed, like every word was trying to beat a clock. "Zoe, "If you ever find this," it began. But it wasn't addressed to Zoe. It was addressed to Richard Cole. "RC, I don't know if this will ever reach you. I don't know if they'll let it, but if somehow you find her, I need you to know the truth." Zoe's breath caught. Her mother's words weren't poetic. They were urgent, desperate. Each line revealed more of what had been hidden. All her life. "I didn't leave because I wanted to. I ran because I had to, because someone found out." Angela's letter unfolded like a confession. She had been pregnant when she disappeared. She had told no one, not even Richard. She had uncovered something inside Cole Automotive, a scandal tied to illegal deals, falsified documents, something Richard may have been unaware of, but someone else knew she had found out. She had planned to confront Richard but got scared. "I wanted to protect you," the letter read, "and I had to protect Zoe." The last paragraph shook Zoe the most. "If Zoe is reading this, I'm sorry. I never wanted to leave you with him. But I had no choice." Zoe had to reread that line 3 times. "Leave you with him. Him who?" Back at his office, Richard stared at the report on Carl. The file was thicker now, and it didn't paint a good picture. Carl Deacon had moved between jobs, towns, and identities. He had worked for a foster care subcontractor, one flagged multiple times for negligence. Several children had come through his care. None stayed long. One report, half buried in a PDF, mentioned a girl taken into custody without paperwork. The dates matched Angela's disappearance. Richard slammed the laptop shut. This wasn't custody, this was theft, this was a cover-up, and he had let it happen, blind to it all, wrapped up in his empire, while a child he didn't know existed was handed off like inventory. Zoe folded the letter, hands shaking. She didn't cry, but the tears were close. Her throat burned. Her mother had loved her, had tried to protect her, and she had known about Richard. Known he wasn't the enemy. For the first time, Zoe understood something clearly. Carl had lied. Not just a small lie, a whole life built on deception. Every time he said, "You're lucky I took you in," every time he silenced her questions, it was all to keep the truth buried. And now she had it, in her hands, written proof, a voice from the past telling her it was time. That night she returned home later than usual. Carl was on the porch, smoking. He didn't speak when she passed him, but she felt his eyes on her back. She went straight to her room, shut the door, and locked it. She took out the letter and placed it flat on her desk. Then she pulled out a notebook and began writing a plan. She would find Richard again. This time she wouldn't wait for him to come. She had a name, she had a city, and she had something to show him that would change everything. Richard, at the same time, was already in motion. He had set a meeting with a journalist he trusted, someone who had helped him years ago expose a rival's corruption. He wanted to go public, quietly. At first, with what he had discovered, but before anything else, he needed one thing: Zoe. Not just for validation, for connection, for truth. He wasn't going to let this disappear like before. The only question was, would she believe him? The next day, as the sun rose again over the desert, 2 paths began to move toward each other, one driven by guilt, the other by clarity. Zoe no longer doubted who she was, and Richard no longer doubted what had been taken from him. Between them now stood only one man, Carl Deacon, and both knew his time holding secrets was running out. Richard Cole stood in the center of his private study, surrounded by manila folders and digital files open on 3 different monitors. The walls, once pristine and lined with awards and photographs of business milestones, were now plastered with printouts, red string, and scribbled notes. It looked more like a detective's bunker than the office of one of LA's most respected entrepreneurs. But Richard didn't care about optics anymore. Not after what he had discovered. What started as an investigation into Carl Deacon had exploded into something much larger. Patterns had emerged, unmistakable ones. Girls like Zoe, mothers like Angela, all vanishing under strangely similar circumstances. Each case threaded through one central corridor, a shell network of foster agencies and emergency placement services contracted quietly through the Cole Foundation. At first, Richard refused to believe it couldn't be his company, not the empire he built, but the paperwork was clear. Funding routed to partner organizations, those organizations tied to third-party providers, each provider linked to a case, sometimes a missing child, sometimes a silent payout, and sometimes nothing at all, just names on lists that disappeared from public records. And then there were the falsified medical waivers, forged parental release forms, adoption transfers with no family follow-ups. The deeper he dug, the more undeniable it became. Someone inside his own house had been facilitating something monstrous, and Angela had discovered it. Angela's last emails, retrieved from an old private archive, showed she had flagged concerns about one of the providers a month before she vanished. She had tried to raise alarms, had even scheduled a meeting with Richard, a meeting he cancelled, too busy, with an investor summit in New York. That meeting never happened. 2 weeks later, she was gone. No note, no trace, just silence. Richard stared at her final message. "We need to talk. It's serious. I don't know who to trust." It had gone unopened in his inbox until now. Now he read it over and over. Again, each word burning. Across town, Zoe sat in the same corner of the scrapyard she had discovered days earlier, her backpack zipped tight around the letter and her hand locked over her mother's ring. Her world had cracked open. The letter didn't just tell her about her mother's fear. It named people, agencies. It warned of what would happen if they found out she was still alive. Zoe didn't know who they were, but she knew what they had done. She could feel it now every time Carl looked at her with that tightening jaw and restless pacing. He wasn't just scared she'd run. He was scared someone would find her, or that she would find them first. That night, Zoe pretended to sleep. Carl had started packing boxes, duffel bags. He didn't say why, but the urgency in his actions was louder than any words. He moved like a man trying to disappear. Again, she watched through the crack in the door as he made hushed phone calls, whispering into a burner phone. "It's not safe anymore," he said. "She's asking questions. She's seen the ring." Then, after a long pause, "No, I burned the originals. I told you, there's nothing left but the kid and the man. If they connect, we're done." Zoe pulled back from the door, hands clenched. That was enough. She had to act. Back at the penthouse, Richard took a long, slow breath before making the call. His lawyer, then his head of security, then finally a private contact in the media, a journalist he trusted who had helped him years ago with a quiet expose on a corporate rival. "I have something bigger," he said. "It's personal." When the journalist asked for a hint, Richard answered with 2 words: "Stolen children." The silence on the line was long. Then, "I'll be there in an hour." Richard hung up and paced. If the world knew what he knew, it wouldn't just be the company at risk. His name, his life, everything could fall. But he had made up his mind. This wasn't just about reputation anymore. This was about redemption. Zoe made her decision the next morning. She wrote a short note, folded the copy of the letter, placed both inside an envelope and sealed it tight. She found an address on the back of Richard's business card, the one he had dropped when he drove off weeks earlier. She memorized the route to the nearest mailbox in town and waited until Carl was distracted by a phone call. She ran, fast, never looking back, until the letter dropped into the blue slot and the metal door snapped shut. The moment it did, she felt something shift. She had taken back control, even if it was just for a second. Later that day, Richard received the envelope on his office desk. His assistant had no idea who left it. There was no return name, just his initials typed on the outside, RC. He opened it and immediately recognized Angela's handwriting. Then the second page, Zoe's. She had written, "I'm ready to talk, but I don't know how much time I have. If you're reading this, I believe you." Come find me before he makes me disappear. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. It was real. She knew. She was reaching out, and she was in danger. Richard didn't wait. He cancelled his meetings, called his driver, and grabbed the file. No more investigators, no more lawyers. It was time to He faced this himself. He had spent 10 years running from a mistake he didn't even know he'd made. Now, the consequences had a name, a face, and a voice, and she was asking for help. Richard Cole never thought the worst betrayal of his life would come from someone who had once toasted champagne beside him at his wedding reception. Gregory Lang wasn't just a CFO or colleague. He had been family, a mentor, someone who had watched Richard rise and had guided him through the chaos of building a corporate empire. So when the last piece of the puzzle snapped into place, emails, signatures, and internal memos that all pointed directly to Gregory's involvement in the conspiracy, Richard didn't feel rage first. He felt disbelief, cold, sharp disbelief. He had hoped, for just a moment, that maybe someone else had manipulated the documents. Maybe the system had been hijacked without his knowledge. But Gregory's initials were on too many lines, and the timestamps matched too many decisions. The betrayal was complete, and worse than that, it had been deliberate. He arranged the meeting himself. No lawyers, no board members, just him and Gregory in a private corporate suite at the top of the downtown tower Richard once called his fortress. The view was still breathtaking, sun spilling over a glass skyline, but today it felt like mockery. Gregory entered like it was a routine. Budget update, but Richard didn't stand. He didn't offer coffee, he simply slid a file across the table. "Read," he said. Gregory opened it slowly, but his face barely changed. Only the faint twitch in his temple betrayed recognition. Inside was the full chain. Emails authorizing silent transfers of funds to shell non-profits, contracts with emergency placement agencies, and falsified legal documents bearing Angela's name. "This isn't what it looks like," Gregory started, but Richard cut him off. "Don't insult me." Gregory leaned back, the paper still in his hands. "It got out of control," he said quietly. "Angela started asking questions she wasn't supposed to ask. You were distracted. Media tours, expansion deals. She didn't know how much she was putting at risk." Richard's hands curled into fists. "You knew she was pregnant." Gregory looked up, startled for the first time. "I suspected." That was enough. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. "You let them erase her. You let them take my child. And then you stood beside me for 10 years and said nothing." Gregory didn't respond. His silence was worse than an admission. It was the sound of guilt that had learned to survive by being quiet. "I kept the company clean," Gregory said, as if that excused the rest. "We couldn't afford a scandal. You were building a legacy." Richard laughed, bitter and short. "And what legacy is that, Greg? A name on a building built on secrets?" The older man looked away. "You wouldn't have handled the truth." The words echoed for a second. Richard stepped closer. "You didn't give me the chance." And then he added, voice raw, "She trusted me. She thought I'd protect her." The silence between them stretched long. Gregory finally whispered, "She was going to go to the press. If that letter got out." But it hadn't, because someone stopped her, and Richard no longer needed to ask who. Across the city, Zoe sat in the back of a coffee shop, her hoodie pulled low, her backpack on her lap. She hadn't spoken to Carl since the morning before, when he'd woken her with a duffel bag and the words, "We're leaving tonight." No explanation, no warning, just orders. But she knew what was happening. He had heard the press was circling. He'd seen Richard on TV. The walls were closing in, and he was trying to disappear again. Only this time Zoe wouldn't let him. She had the ring, the letter, and now she had a voice. She pulled out a prepaid phone Richard had given her during their last meeting and texted 2 words. "It's time." Richard didn't hesitate. He left Gregory in the room with the file and walked straight out the door, calling his head of security mid-stride. "We need eyes on Carl Deacon. Now. He's going to run." As he spoke, the memories crashed down. Angela sitting on their balcony, hands on her stomach, whispering baby names. Her voice when she said she wasn't sure who to trust. The fact that she never got to tell him everything because someone had stolen her. Chance. And now, that same someone was about to steal their daughter again. Richard wouldn't let it happen twice. Gregory sat alone in the conference room, staring at the documents. He didn't shred them. He didn't run. He knew the end had come. Somewhere, reporters were reading copies of the same file. Somewhere, government investigators were opening sealed indictments. The truth was out, and the lie he had lived inside was collapsing. His phone buzzed with messages he didn't answer. For the first time in 20 years, Gregory Lang had nothing to say. Zoe returned home to find the trailer. Half-packed. Carl didn't even pretend to smile. "Get your things," he said. "Now." She stood still. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe." She looked him in the eyes. "From who?" Carl didn't answer. She stepped back. "I'm not going." His jaw clenched. "You don't get a choice." But she did. She had already made it. Her phone buzzed. One ping, a single signal. Help was on the way. Richard was already en route, following the coordinates she'd sent. This time, he wasn't coming as a businessman or as a ghost from a buried past. He was coming as a father. For the first time in years, he had clarity. He knew what he was fighting for, not for his name, not for his legacy, but for Zoe, for Angela, for truth. And as the desert wind began to rise outside the old trailer, Richard's car tore down the highway toward the reckoning that had been delayed for a decade too long. The desert stretched wide and cruel ahead of Richard's speeding car, the heat mirage blurring the edges of the highway as the wheels devoured the miles. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, jaw locked in silent determination. The GPS tracker pulsed on his dashboard, a single red dot marking Zoe's location. Her final message had been brief but urgent. "He's packing. Tonight. Hurry." Richard had read those words 100 times in his mind as the miles passed. He didn't care about police protocols, legal risks, or reputational damage. That girl was his daughter, and this was no longer about who was right. This was about who got to her first. At the trailer, Carl was growing more frantic by the minute. He'd stuffed cash into a lockbox, tossed burner phones into a bag, and was now pacing by the door, watching for movement outside. Zoe sat at the kitchen table, pretending to be calm, her backpack resting by her feet. Inside were the ring, the letter, a copy of the DNA results Richard had given her, and the photo of her mother she never let go of. Every second felt like a countdown. She knew Carl was on edge. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. He had moved from control to panic, and panic made him dangerous. Carl turned to her. "You ready?" She looked up and said nothing. He stepped closer. "We're not waiting around, Zoe." His voice cracked slightly, not with sadness, but with fear. "You don't understand who those people are." She stood, slow, deliberate. "You mean people like my dad?" The words froze him, his eyes narrowed. "He lied to you." She didn't blink. "So did you." That was the moment the air shifted. Carl took a step forward, fists tightening, but before he could speak again, the sound of tires skidding outside snapped both of their heads toward the window. Richard kicked the door open before Carl could react. The slam of wood against metal echoed like a gunshot. "Step away from her!" he shouted, voice thunderous. Carl spun around, hand halfway to his pocket, but Richard crossed the room in 3 strides and slammed him into the wall before he could reach whatever he was grabbing. Years of restrained rage exploded in that second. The 2 men wrestled, crashing into furniture, knocking over the table. Zoe screamed, but didn't run. She stood frozen, watching the man who'd claimed to protect her and the man who had come to save her finally collide. Carl fought hard, dirty, fast, desperate. He grabbed a wrench from the kitchen counter and swung, grazing Richard's shoulder. Richard tackled him again, driving him to the floor. The ring on Zoe's finger caught the light as she stepped forward, watching Carl scramble, panting, wild-eyed. "You were never supposed to know," Carl spat, pinned beneath Richard's arm. "None of this was meant for you." Richard didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence was heavier than any threat. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Someone had called them. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe Zoe had activated the backup plan Richard gave her. It didn't matter. Help was coming. When the police arrived minutes later, Richard stepped out of the trailer with a busted lip, blood on his collar, and Zoe at his side. She gripped his hand, not like a child looking for protection, but like someone making a choice. Carl was handcuffed, shoved into the back of a patrol car, screaming curses that no one paid attention to. An officer tried to separate Richard and Zoe, asking routine questions, but she wouldn't let go of him. "He's my dad," she said, clear and firm. The officer backed off. It was over, for now. Back at Richard's home, her new home, Zoe sat on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, the weight of the last few hours still heavy on her small frame. Richard knelt in front of her, not knowing what to say. No apology could touch what had been done. No. Words could erase the lost years, but Zoe didn't ask for that. She only asked one thing. "Did you love her?" she said. Richard nodded. "More than anything." She stared at the ring on her hand. "Then why didn't you come sooner?" His answer was a whisper. "Because I didn't know. But now I do. And I'm not leaving." Later that night, Zoe stood alone in the hallway, looking at a photo of Angela Richard had placed on the shelf. Her mother looked young, vibrant, and free. Before everything, Zoe touched the glass gently. "I found him," she whispered. And for the first time in what felt like forever, her heart let go of something it had been holding too tightly for too long. Not the pain, but the fear that she was alone, the fear that no one would come. Someone had. Finally. Richard had always believed that resolution came with punishment, that once someone paid the price, the scales of justice would settle and the ache would fade. But as he stood outside the courthouse with Zoe beside him, Carl Deacon being led away in cuffs through the back loading dock, he felt no satisfaction. There was no applause, no celebration, no closure, just a cold wind, a sun that wouldn't warm his skin, and the weight of everything he hadn't known sitting heavy on his shoulders. Zoe said nothing, watching Carl disappear into the armored van. She didn't smile, she didn't flinch. Her fingers held tightly to the edges of her backpack, and on her right hand, the ring glinted beneath the pale light. It was her mother's ring. Her ring now, a reminder that survival didn't look like victory. It looked like standing still when the world wanted you to collapse. Back at the house, their house now, Richard moved through the rooms like a man relearning space. He had cleared out the guest suite and turned it into a bedroom for Zoe, but she rarely stayed in it those first few days. She slept on the couch most nights, curled under the same grey blanket, her backpack always nearby. Richard didn't question it. He understood that comfort had little to do with pillows or square footage. It had to do with control, with trust, with memory. And those things don't return on command. They have to be rebuilt, one gesture at a time. So he started with breakfast. Every morning he made something, sometimes pancakes, sometimes eggs, sometimes just toast with cinnamon, and left it for her without asking if she'd eat. Sometimes she did, sometimes she didn't, but each time the plate was clean by noon. She began to open up slowly, not in stories, not in answers, but in questions. "Did you ever lie to my mom?" she asked one day over tea. "No," Richard said, "but I ignored her when I shouldn't have." Zoe nodded once and said, "Okay." That was it. But it was everything. In those quiet moments, trust began to flicker back into her voice. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure. It was the beginning of something else. Honesty. And honesty was rare in Zoe's life. She'd been lied to since she could remember. People had spoken for her, over her, about her. Richard didn't do that. He listened. Even when the silence was long, Zoe started drawing again. She used to sketch cars. As a kid, muscle cars mostly, with flames on the side and huge engines bursting through the hood. Now she drew memories. A trailer door left slightly open, a hand holding a wrench, a pair of boots beside a crib. She showed Richard one of them. It was a woman's hand holding a baby's foot, and on the woman's finger was the same ring Zoe now wore. "I remember this," she said. Richard didn't speak. He didn't need to. He could feel the truth of that image tightening around his throat. Angela had been there, and Zoe had kept her, even if just in fragments. That was more than he ever had. The press didn't stop. Headlines flared and cooled like wildfires. Billionaire's daughter found after decade. Foster father at center of child trafficking scandal. Whistleblowers warning ignored by CEO. Richard faced them all. He gave interviews, released statements, sat beside Zoe in a courtroom when she chose to testify, not for vengeance, but for validation. "People need to hear it from me," she said, and they did. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She spoke with a calm, cutting truth that silenced entire rooms. After the broadcast, Richard received hundreds of letters, survivors, parents, journalists. But none of them mattered as much as the note Zoe left on his nightstand that night. "Thanks for letting me talk, and for not trying to explain anything after." In the garage, the Mustang sat partially disassembled. It had become their project, their ritual. After dinner, they'd spend hours fixing bolts, testing lights, replacing panels. Richard taught her how to rotate the drive belt. She taught him how to solder a cracked circuit. They worked in quiet rhythm, sometimes with music playing low in the background, usually her mother's favorite, 70s soul. The first time she hummed along, Richard nearly broke down, but he held it in. That moment wasn't about him. It was about her claiming space, finding music inside herself again. One evening, Richard found Zoe staring at a framed photo of Angela in the hallway, her expression unreadable. "Do you think she'd be proud of me?" she asked. Richard nodded. "Absolutely." She looked back at the photo. "I'm scared I'll forget what she sounded like." He reached into a drawer and handed her a cassette tape, Angela's old voicemail recording salvaged from her office line. When Zoe heard the voice, she didn't cry, she just smiled. "That's her," she whispered. "That's really her." It was the first time Richard saw her smile fully. No mask, no armor, just light. Weeks later, they stood together on a hill overlooking the edge of the desert. Zoe had asked to go back to the place she last remembered feeling safe, an old gas station ruin where her mother once stopped to fix a stranger's car. They brought a single rose and a print of Angela's photo. Zoe placed it gently on the cement and sat beside it for almost an hour. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Then she stood, took off the ring, kissed it, and slipped it back on. "It's my turn now," she said. The drive home was quiet. Zoe leaned her head on the window. Richard kept glancing at her in the mirror, not to check, just to remember. When they got home, she went straight to her room, but in the morning there was a note on the kitchen counter. A sentence, neat handwriting, clear message. "Some stories don't begin with love, they begin with a lie, but love survives anyway." Richard read it 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in his wallet. The ring had survived. So had Zoe. So had he. Hi, I'm Irlan, and this was another unforgettable story here on Tales of the Heart. If this moved you even a little, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment telling me what part hit you the hardest. And most important, send this to someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the truth doesn't scream, it whispers through stories like this. See you in the next one.